Well, Jamie, it is great to be back here at the J. Flinch Broadcast Center. And I'm eager to dig into this particular conversation. And I'm going to, say something provocative here. I'm going to say that I am unapologetically selfish, or at least self-interested, and I suspect that you are too, and also without any sheepishness about that. In fact, it's irrational to not be self-interested. But something that I'm eager for us to dig into today is when it comes to advancing our self-interest, what's the time horizon that we use for calculating ROI?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting dimension to being selfish, right? And what's the gain and how do you perceive it? And so that's our episode 7 of Happy Heuristics, shock-resistant leader routines and rules of thumb for a complex world. So we want to help leaders at all different levels be more consistent and rapid with their decision making using heuristics so that they can free up their bandwidth to take on the other challenges with extra brain power and not be constrained. So dealing with a very complex world, the heuristics help quite a bit. So we're into episode 7, and our theme is evaluating success on a long-term horizon.
Yeah, that time horizon is something I think people overlook. So, I'll go ahead and jump in with my heuristic, and I'll put the asterisk that it's not really a heuristic, but it does imply some heuristics, and it's be long-term greedy. And where this came from is there was a managing director at Goldman Sachs in the 1970s named Gus Levy, and it was known at the time that Goldman Sachs had a certain reputation that was a little brighter than others, and was thought to have a great culture, better than other houses on Wall Street. And he was asked, what makes Goldman Sachs special? And he said, at Goldman Sachs, like everybody else, we are greedy, but we're long-term greedy. And what he meant by that is that when other houses, when other brokerage houses were faced with decisions that would make more money now, even if that came at a cost or risk to longer term reputation or to their customers, the other houses would tend to do the thing that was short term greedy. And at Goldman Sachs, they were longer term focused. So it wasn't like they were more moral than anybody else. It wasn't they were do-gooders. It was just the time horizon for calculating ROI. They would do things, so that there were deals that they wouldn't do because of that long-term basis. And that stayed pretty much intact in that culture until after they went public and became subject to the same quarterly, short-term pressures like all the other publicly traded houses, and and that showed up in their compensation schemes. And ultimately they took in the financial crisis of 2008, they ended up taking a bailout, and their CEO testified in front of Congress and said, he didn't say it in these words, but basically cop to, we had compensation structures that rewarded the wrong thing, and what they rewarded was a shorter term payoff. I've written about this. I wrote an article for chief executive on being long-term greedy, and I asked them to title it Gordon Gekko Was Half Right. Gordon Gekko was the character who's thought as a villain in Wall Street, who says greed is good. And he was half right in the sense that we're all self-interested, like we've been saying. When we talk about greed, what we're really talking about is, we're speaking pejoratively about someone else's choices to advance their own self-interest. But we're all self-interested. And so this is really about reclaiming, that word greed and saying, we all want stuff in the long run. How do we advance that likelihood? This, and it has some really practical implications. So like I said, be long-term greedy. That's more like a mantra than a heuristic, but it is if you get into a mode of nudging yourself, of being mindful of what would it mean to calculate return on investment on a longer than typical time horizon, it can lead to some more productive choices in very simple ways. For example, if you are thinking about, I've got an employee who is not behaving or not performing the way they want to, I have a choice to make. Do I confront them or not? So if my time horizon for calculating ROI is the end of today, I'm going to go, hell no, I don't need that. I've already had so many stresses this week, and I've got so many things on my plate. That seems like a terrible way of advancing my self-interest, because all I'm thinking about is how can I show up, or how can I get through the day. But if I'm thinking about even 3 months or 6 months, then I go, I got to do something about this, because the cost of not doing something about this behavior performance is actually pretty high. That's a cost that I would rather not pay. And so my long-term greed, my longer-term self-interest is like, like suck it up and have the conversation.
Yeah, and I would think that, so as you talk about long-term greed, and this is perhaps where, the other half of Gordon Gekko not getting it right, you're not just talking about financial metrics. You're talking about whatever your self-interest is, which
exactly
could be happiness, could be sustainability, could be building a legacy, could be a lot of different things. And you kind of said it's not really a heuristic, but I think in terms of how it's used, if you just look at those moments and say, what's the long-term greedy choice, it operates like a heuristic regardless.
It does. Yeah. A lot of times in coaching, leaders, most people are fully capable of rationalizing whatever the hell it is that they are doing right now. And I think sometimes what happens is when they're sitting with a coach, they are thinking about, well, this is what a consultant is telling me to do because this is what they're telling me is conventional, or they're coming at it from a moralistic frame. And I'm not comfortable with either of those approaches. My orientation is with the leaders I coach primarily to say, no, I get why you're doing what you're doing. Let's acknowledge what it is that you're getting. Now let's talk about what it's costing you. Mm-hmm. So it's all framed within that framework of self-interest and cost-benefit analyses. And so a lot of times when you're asking people, okay, so this behavior of yours that's costing you something, whatever they're doing now is helping them now, but it's coming at a longer term cost. And one of the things I think is important to get people to help them shift behaviors is to have them come to the realization that it is actually rational for them to do so. I think you have to be pretty damn persuasive to get people to change behavior, a behavior that they're comfortable with now, and get them to do something that isn't rational. So that's where I think this temporal framework becomes so important for framing our decisions about how we advance our own interest.
So I'd imagine one of the pushbacks, and I'm curious if you have this conversation or how it goes, is that, I want to be long-term greedy, but, if you're a company, you say, well, if we don't perform this quarter, there'll be activist investors that'll push us out. Or as an employee, if I don't perform this quarter, then I'll get fired. And so I don't have an opportunity to be long-term greedy.
Yeah.
So whether it's the imagined incentives, the actual incentives that feel like, I want to operate this way, but I can't. How do you leverage long-term greedy under those constraints?
Yeah, I love this topic. So, because here's the thing that we know about our brains. We didn't evolve. Natural selection was not filtering for who would make a great leader. It was filtering for survival. We are this species with that aren't that well protected. We've got these soft bellies that we expose by standing upright, and So we only survive by actually being very defensive and having very defensive instincts. And so, one of the things when you talk about the long term, survival is actually a very short term focused deal. It doesn't matter what hypothetically is going to happen 6 months from now if I'm dead, right? So if you go, well, you shouldn't eat Twinkies, I'd go, yeah. But if it's the only food and I haven't eaten for 3 days, then I'm probably eating Twinkies, right? I need to get some carbs from somewhere. So, and I think, Nassim Taleb emphasizes this a lot, that he says that he's critical of, for example, the marshmallow test, which is the idea that they give these kids 2 marshmallows, or no, they give them 1 marshmallow, and they say if you can avoid eating it for 10 minutes, then you get a second marshmallow. So delayed gratification, right? And the premise of the research is delayed gratification is associated with better, longer term life outcomes. And the critique there is that if you're operating from a survival instinct, that's a nice idea, but we should not be actually. Maybe there's something to be said for the kids who eat the marshmallow, because it's like get it while you can, because you don't know where your next set of calories is going to come from in a world with scarce resources.
Right. Maybe you don't want to trust that system. So
right.
So I think risk management is a whole nother topic, but for maybe a episode 10 or 11 or 12. But those risks many times are overinflated, both in probability and impact, right? So,
right.
So I'll tell people, it's like, what if I get fired? Well, there's very few talented people I know where getting fired didn't turn into a blessing.
Right.
Right. And you go, what's the worst that could happen? And we think it's way more probable than it is, and we think it's way worse than it is, and that's certainly, again, that's that defensive stance.
Right. Yeah. 100%. That's we do tend to exaggerate both the risk and the how catastrophic would it be if it occurred. For example, this whole idea of like you said, I'm going to keep my powder dry. I'm going to pick my battles, and so I'm going to operate that way an entire career. It's like you probably have cost yourself really tremendously in the opportunities that you didn't get. And even if it meant getting fired, as long as you're not physically dead, you were probably you would have set yourself on a path to be in a better place.
Yeah. So one other question I have around this is the time frame of long-term greedy. So Jeff Laker writes about in the Toyota Way, Toyota making decisions. I forget now if it's a 30-year or a 50-year time horizon, but the fundamental idea is it's pretty long. So how do you determine the long-term time horizon, and does it matter?
Yeah, so my cop-out on this that I adopted a few years ago was to simply say longer than typical. Yeah. Calculate your decisions based on the ROI on your decisions based on a longer than typical time horizon. So again, most of us don't think about, we don't say the ROI on having a tough conversation. We don't think about it typically literally in those terms. But if we reflect on our own decisions and go, yeah, my time horizon is if I unpacked my decision making, unpack that algorithm, it would be I'm trying to decide what helps me get through the day most easily, or if I work out or I don't work out, it's probably a day, right? So longer than typical, could be 2 days. I'm not sure that also makes that big of a difference. So I'm exposing the flaws in the longer than typical, but, it's probably something like, in order for the dramatic difference in that cost benefit analysis to come through, it's probably a function of, what do you think? Like, it's probably more like 10 days or 2 months. I mean, there is quite a bit of a multiplier, at least there,
Right.
in terms of it's so obvious that the easiest way to get through the day is to not exercise or to not have that tough conversation. But yeah, it does need to get a bit longer before it becomes so dramatically obvious that it is in my rational self-interest to exercise today, that it is in my rational self-interest to have that tough conversation.
So it's really contextual, right? Investment decision, tough conversations. You go from today versus 10 days. You go from a year to 10 years. It's very contextual, but that makes it a flexible heuristic.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I feel like I took about 300 words to say that I don't have an answer, but that's
sometimes that's when we have an answer, it doesn't take quite as long. So.
Right.
Excellent. So anything else to add on this be long-term greedy?
Well, in our last podcast, we threw in some Bitcoin, crypto, NFT references, and so I'm not trying to make it a habit, but this is something that has come back into that the Bitcoin community has popularized. They don't say long-term greedy; they say low time preference, and the idea is, the theory is that because there's only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin, as opposed to the dollar, which some ridiculous numbers of dollars that have ever existed, came in, were printed in the last few years. That of course it's going to be inflationary. So the idea is if you hold your dollar, if your currency, if your store of value is rapidly losing value, then it actually is very rational to spend it as fast as you can. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of hodling in part is that if you've got a reliable store of value, then you have lower time preference. And so that is a community that has sort of, jumped on this bandwagon of changing time horizons and, I think has contributed to the conversation.
Interesting. Okay.
All right. So let's switch and move over to your heuristic, which I think is related.
Okay. So mine is basically focusing on day n+1. And this actually came out of more personal practice around my old consulting firm. And it was really about always making sure that what you left behind was of value. Mm-hmm. And so I had seen, I think I don't know if this is exactly how it was generated, but it certainly was an observation. There was a particular consulting firm that I would follow many times into a client. And as I would come into that client, I'd see this other large, well-known consulting firm had been there and left behind a mess, right? They had delivered on what they promised. They're like, we promised X, and they delivered on X, which is day N, right? Mm-hmm. So the last day of the engagement, we have delivered what we said we would deliver. But in the wake of that, it was just absolute mess, a lot of people upset, a lot of new problems generated. And I don't think it was, you might say, oh, it's intentional. Now you have to come back and hire them again to fix those problems. And I don't think it was so much that. It was just such a hyper focus on the day end deliverable. They just didn't worry about the day end. So I took on this mindset of day n+1, which is, as the day after you walk away, what are they saying about you? What are they saying about what you delivered? What is the impact on what you delivered?
Yeah.
So day N could be, that's just consulting, come out of consulting and think about it as a boss, right? You're somebody's boss and then they move on to what's it like the day after they leave you?
Yeah.
Not just, are they sad to leave you, but what happens after they leave you? A company, any customer relationship, you would even say a lifetime, right? So, one of these exercises is write your own eulogy and then work backwards to your life. It's kind of that's kind of the same mentality, right? So N could be, 4 hours, or I'll say this podcast, right? This podcast is 30 minutes.
Yeah.
How do people think about it? Did we entertain them for 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Or at the 31st minute, are they still thinking about what ideas we spewed? 30 minutes or 6 months or 10 years or a career or whatever that might be. That's why I use N, right? Because you don't know what N's going to be.
Yeah.
It's always thinking about what is true and what is true right after you're done that engagement, and have less control over future adjustments.
One thing that's so interesting to me about that is, a lot of the focus in organizations right now, where it's about how do we create more value for people who pay us money, or people who don't pay us money, or get us to advertisers, is user experience, right? So user experience is important, but user experience is about what's happening while we're there, and not what is the remnant of that experience. And that's there's probably opportunity there, because it seems like that is that's the difference between, with that consulting firm you were describing, the difference between the totality of the experience as it is, as the totality of the value or lack of value as experienced, even in the absence of the consulting firm. So they pat themselves on the back for delivering to the letter of whatever's in the scope of work, but that's not the totality of the experience. And so expanding that time horizon could have some interesting implications for decision making.
Yeah, and I think that value, how do you evaluate value, right? So you'll say, well, does a TV show entertain you for 30 minutes, or do you talk about it the next day?
Right.
And that's a different kind of TV show, right? And I think fewer of those exist than maybe used to. I might just be the ones that I related to, but nevertheless, and so I think there's two major outcomes from this. One, and you kind of alluded to this, is what are the unintended consequences? What other impact did you have? And so if you care about that and you're paying attention to that, then you do having that focus of beyond your user experience, right? Is I gave you this user experience, you liked it. But now this is also true, right? I'm a purveyor of sugary drinks. Okay, well, what are the consequences of that after 10 years? Not great. And so most of those drink providers are trying to figure out how to think about the consequences. They're maybe not all that aggressive about fixing them, but they're at least providing options and playing in that space. And then the other is the sustainability of what you deliver, right? How if you truly care about value, and you should care about the sustainability of that value, right? So I recently I went to Lehigh University. I've spent a lot of time on campus doing some things recently, and even was giving a speech and talking about the value you get in your education of being there for 4 years isn't the information they stuck in your brain.
Right.
Like, a lot of that stuff you could probably Google.
Right.
It's training your brain how to think. It's generating curiosity and intellectual agility and the ability to learn and problem solve that. And that's sustainable value, right? If it's just delivering content, well, video can work, right? But that's not... The value is what is true the day after you graduate. Right.
Both in terms of the knowledge that you probably retain not that much of. It's about how you've learned to think, and the relationships and experiences that have presumably built confidence and capability.
Yeah. And I think similar to yours, where there are people saying, well, I'm going to get fired if I don't do this, or activist investor or whatever, and I can't be long-term greedy. I think there's the same I'll say moral hazards in this, which is, well, I signed a contract to deliver X by day N, and so that's what I'm here to do, and so it is easy to then focus on that on day N, because it's contractual, because it's locked in, or I need to pass a test, right, to get certified to do something. So, if I don't pass the test, it doesn't matter what I learned along the way, right? But that, to many ways, as I sort of think through that, it's the same sort of moral hazard. Is we if we only focus on day N at the expense of day N plus 1, just like passing the test. I got certified. If I didn't get certified, of course, maybe it was all for naught. But do we overestimate the importance of getting certified relative to what we learned in order to get certified?
Right. Yeah. That brings to mind, I used to do a lot of work with Kaiser Permanente, and a long time ago they had a CEO named George Halverson, and he wrote a book on reforming healthcare. And he said a core problem of the U.S. healthcare system is we've got all these doctors, they want to do the right thing, but the problem is they need to do the billable right thing. And so what makes money is are things that are about testing and treating symptoms, as opposed to going after sort of those root cause issues that actually cost the U.S. healthcare system so much, like diabetes and hypertension. And so their model is to align financial incentives between providers and insurers more clearly, so that you got the focus on the longer term health maintenance of the member and patient. But again, that's based on a longer term time horizon. And I think it reflects long-term greedy. It also reflects your heuristic, because it's really about what is happening after this. When people interact with us, what happens after that?
Yeah, so I think the impact of these two heuristics is quite similar. I think the hazards we face in using them are similar. I think the use cases are different, right? Whereas I think yours is we don't know what N is, right? So I'm working here until I no longer work here. So it's within those time boundaries, right? So let's say I'm going to do this job for 5 years. Long term is 5 years versus 5 weeks, whereas mine is more focused, I think, on when we where we can imagine what day N is. And we maybe have our sights set on that deliverable, whatever that might be, and then what is true afterwards. So I think the impact is in many ways similar. I think yours is probably more impactful on overcoming difficult decisions and actions, whereas mine is perhaps a little more focused on rethinking value. So I think that maybe, I don't know if it's, I'm not sure people will just choose and map them into those circumstances, but I think that the use cases of them are different, but the general impact of them are probably the same.
Yeah, I like this, and I'm going to borrow that. I do leadership circle profiles with a lot of leaders, and it's very instinctive for people, I think, when they get a 360 profile, to see it as a list of problems to be solved. And I invite them to not think of it that way. And anytime I'm with someone where they tell me, or I intuit that they've got 3 or 4 years left in their career, I go, let's not focus. Then I think it becomes really important to not see it as a list of problems to be solved. It's data that can inform the decision about what's true the day after you leave here, both for the organization, for the team, for the people you care about, for the people you have the opportunity to mentor and develop, and of course for you and your family when you're the day after you walk out.
Right, and that includes how you feel about your time there, but also whatever you choose to do next. Right. So I think that's that goes along with people especially more senior people who feel they've achieved quite a bit, not continuing to invest in becoming a better leader because they feel the return on investment is too low. So all right. Well, I think that probably covers this theme and these heuristics. So we really thank everyone for joining us for episode 7 of Happy Heuristics, and we do hope as we kind of took these heuristics along that people think about not just borrowing them and adopting them, but also just learning to think through how they use heuristics and come up with their own. And rather than us talk about it just theoretically, we hope these examples help make people smarter about that.
Yeah, sounds good. And you've got a bonus heuristic to wrap us up?
Yep. Yeah, so bonus heuristic. We always like to finish this way. So put your angry letter in the drawer overnight, or the angry email in your draft folder before you decide to send it.
Yeah, I probably could have used this one a few times in the past.
We all could.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.